Great. Well, thank you for checking out Public Finance Conversations. Today, we're joined with Dr. Tim McLarney. I work with Dr. Tim McLarney throughout the state of California on many different school district GEO-bond measures, but he does more than that, and he'll talk about that as we go through. But maybe Dr. McLarney, first, let me thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
And then secondly, would you mind walking through your resume with us and how you got to the point you are today?
Sure. So I'm Tim McLarney. I'm the president of True North Research. We're a firm that specializes in working with school districts and other types of public agencies and using surveys to develop a statistically reliable understanding of the communities and the customers that they serve. My background is I didn't plan to do this from a young age. I was actually a college student, and when I declared for my undergrad, I thought I was going to be a mechanical engineer, and somehow came out of 4 years later with a degree in politics, and went on to graduate school with the idea that I was going to be a professor of political science. And about the time I finished my PhD, I realized I didn't want to be a professor, and so wound up literally answering a newspaper ad for somebody who's got strong background in research methods and statistics and knows a bit or two things or so about government. And I thought, well, that's me, one or two things. And so I applied for that job, got it, and wound up in a career in survey research methods for public agencies.
Great. And so your education, you didn't start off wanting to get directly into this field, but you did eventually get a PhD. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So, I didn't know what I was doing today even existed as a career path necessarily. I was always a good student, and I wanted to be a professor in political science. And so I had gone on to graduate school at Cornell to do that. And while there, a lot of my good friends that were in that entering class, there's about 20 of us that entered that year. Most of them are in fact professors at some high-level universities. But I got to the end of the dissertation place, and I was ready to get my PhD, but I kind of realized I didn't want to be an academic, right? That I want to do something else. I mean, the challenge with academics is, you're really talking to other academics. That's that world, right? Your work is for them. They critique your work, and it's kind of a tight circle, and it doesn't usually go much beyond that. I wanted to use my skills, but use them in a way that you could actually have a bigger impact in the communities that you live in and work in. And so I found this opportunity to start working in the survey research field for public agencies. We do lots of different types of surveys, but about half of the work that we do is helping agencies understand, is it feasible for them to move out with a bond or a tax measure of some sort, right, to improve their facilities and or their services? And if it is feasible, how might they go about structuring that measure in a way that it's consistent with the type of measure their voters would be interested in supporting? And I started in on this 25 years ago. After 4 years of working for another firm, kind of had a different vision for what I thought I would like to do in terms of if I had a firm. And so we broke off, myself and my right-hand man at the time, who has also been my business partner now for about 20 years. We broke off to form True North Research, and I think we're 19 years as of August, and still going.
And the structure of True North is a little different than what we see at a lot of survey companies, or a lot of companies in general, where you're still very hands-on with your projects. Is that something you set out to do?
Yeah, that is one of the things that we were very deliberate about when we started True North, and in fact, one of the big motivators for us, forming the company was, we had worked in a larger firm. Got to see how research is typically done in this world. And what you tend to find is, in the research world is, as you grow as a company and you get bigger, there is an inescapable pressure to have the more senior people in the organization become salespeople, right? Because you're trying to, you got more people that you're responsible for, more overhead, and inevitably that means you got to generate a lot more business and do more volume. And that just creates the pressure to where the senior people become full-time sort of marketing and sales. I didn't want to do that, right? I'd spent too much time sort of honing my research skills, and I enjoy it. I'm passionate about research. I didn't want to become full-time sales. And so one of the goals we had when we set out for True North was to keep it small, right? That we weren't going to try and add a bunch of bodies and grow. And by keeping it small, that meant that allowed me to not just do some sales, which obviously we do, but to be able to be the day-to-day hands-on kind of president of a company that where we're involved in the day-to-day work. And as you know, Adam, when we have client meetings or whether it's presentations or design or calls to talk about what the research results are, those are always things that I lead. And that's something that we started out that way almost 20 years ago, and we made the conscious decision to stay that way.
Okay, now, as you develop a survey, talk to us about the structure of a survey and what goes into building that.
Sure. So I think obviously you want to be listening to your clients' research objectives from the outset, right? And as I mentioned, we have lots of different types of research that we do, but a big portion of them are bond feasibility studies for school districts. And so using that as an example, what we're trying to do with that questionnaire is to gather the information that we need to be able to tell our clients, number one, should you be on the ballot, right? Meaning, is this a measure that has a reasonable chance of success if you were to place it on the ballot? Answer that question isn't always yes, right? But the research is designed to kind of tell us that. And then secondly, assuming it is feasible, we have a lot of questions in there that are really designed to help us understand how would you go about structuring your measure in a way that it's consistent with the type of measure a voter in your community is interested in supporting. And so the questionnaire structure is really designed to go out and get us that information. And in particular, we look at what we call our ballot test, where we're presenting a 75-word ballot statement to a voter and asking them their opinion about it. We don't just test that one time in a survey. We actually test that at 3 different junctures within the interview, because what you find is that voters are going to have an initial sort of off-the-cuff reaction to that 75-word ballot statement based on what they sort of naturally know or don't know about to measure. You want to do that very early in the poll, so it's a good clean read about where your voters are today. And then the process of the interview is really about sort of sharing some information with them about this proposal, getting their feedback on those particular aspects. So tax rate, right? The projects that can be funded, arguments pro and con related to the measure. And then you're testing again at a couple different points in the interview that 75-word ballot statement again to get an understanding of how, as they've learned more about this proposal, does it change the way they would ultimately vote on that. And by looking at how the opinions pattern over the course of the interview, and in particular how support may change in response to specific information items, it gives us a good handle on where is your community today, where are they likely to be at the end of an election cycle, and also how might you go about structuring your measure so that you're sort of optimizing its chances for success because you're listening to your voters and gearing that measure according to their priorities.
And I would say you're testing the sensitivity to either the yes or the no or whatever level of support that you have. If you're seeing that thing bounce around the 3 different times you ask it, that people change their mind quickly. If you see that solid, right, that there's maybe communication isn't as important one way or the other.
And it's interesting because you can get in some communities where things are very volatile, right? That support may start out at like 65%, and then the moment you introduce negative arguments, the floor drops out and you lose 10 points. Now you're at 55, right? That's a big difference. And then we've worked in communities where it doesn't matter what you say or do in terms of the information you introduced for a voter, the support levels are rock solid. They hardly ever change. And you're right, that kind of tells you, number one, how important information is to allowing voters in that community to sort of make up their minds, right? Or are you working in a community that, for the most part, voters have already made their minds up, right? And you can sometimes find that more often the case in communities that have dealt with these types of measures in the past. So if you have a community that's already had a couple of school bonds, for example, right? They have some recently, and they have some experience with what a school bond is. You tend to find that there's not as much volatility there, right, as you do in a community where maybe they haven't had one of these measures before. And so this is really a learning exercise as they're going through the interview.
Great. Well, Dr. McLarney. It's always one of my favorite things to do is, and just before I get into one of my favorite things to do here, make sure the audience understands the framework or when this arises. Oftentimes, Dr. McLarney and I are at the podium together. I'm talking about finance. He's talking about the survey. And even though I'm talking about numbers, someone will ask me a survey question, and it's a challenging question. They're trying to get us or poke a hole in something. And I love leaning over and saying, well, Dr. McLarney will be the best one to answer that, just really establishing the expertise here. But before I ask the real question I want to ask is, it must be a pretty funny scene as I poke fun at myself as Dr. McLarney and I are both at the podium because he's about 1.5 feet taller than me. And the microphones
without the hair.
The microphones are always the kind of go, ee! So as he bends the microphone down to me, if you didn't notice the height differential, you definitely heard the height differential. So as I squeak the microphone back up to Dr. McLarney, how do you handle when someone says, I know my community, I drink coffee here every morning, here's what I hear, and you came from out of town and you don't know?
Right. I try to handle it as diplomatically as I can, obviously, first of all. And the reality is, when we're in those situations, the individuals who we're talking with, they've all had a certain amount of success in politics because they're sitting on the other side of the dais, right? So they hold elected positions, and that can lead to a sense of confidence for some that, I really do know what my community's thinking, and I know I have my finger on the pulse of the community because, I'm sitting here, right, on the other side of the dais. I have office, I was elected. And, they are engaged in their community, and they go to these coffee shops and they talk with people regularly. And so I don't want to discount any of that experience. At the same time, the reality is, right, that one of the reasons you do these surveys is because you want to reach out beyond that circle of people who show up at coffees to talk with their representatives or show up at council meetings or board meetings to share their opinion. The reality is there's a lot of voters out there who aren't going to engage in that way. And yet they will have opinions about a proposal, and they will be sharing those on election day, right? And so, that's the whole beauty of inferential statistics, is being able to go out and talk to a larger random sample of that community, and then be able to know with a certain degree of reliability what the actual opinions are of the entire community on this issue. And so, we can talk inferential statistics, we can talk statistical theory, and some of them want to do that, and I love to engage in those kind of conversations. Sometimes they really don't want to do that, right? And in that case, it tends to be, what I tend to find more compelling is talking about track record, is to say, look, we can talk about stats and theory all day long, but at the end of the day, this process works. And it works because, when you look back at the surveys that we do, and when we recommend clients move forward with a measure and go to ballot, and they follow sort of X, Y, and Z strategies, that they're going to be successful. When you look at the track record, ultimately they are at a very, very high percentage. And so that tends to be probably more compelling to some of the electeds than getting into the nuances of statistics.
And so you built the survey, and there's this structure to it. We've talked a little bit about that. But as you monitor the data that comes in, sometimes you look to make some pivots. Is that right? And what's that process like? Are you sitting on a couch and someone says, yeah, or how are you monitoring this data? How does this flow to you?
Yeah, so, when we're in the field, right, you're going to be getting data coming in, and as just from a quality control perspective, you want to be looking at it regularly, right? You don't want to do the whole survey, come back and then crack this open like it's a present and discover, ooh, there's something unusual in here or wrong. And at that point, it's a little late, right, to go in and do anything about it. So we'll keep an eye on the data. Occasionally, we do have situations where the data starts coming back and there are some surprises in the results, and meaning, I can think of several cases where we've gone out in communities that had historically been very supportive of these measures, and they were very tax insensitive. And then all of a sudden, we're in a survey for them, and you look down, you realize, we don't have support at any of the range of tax rates that we're considering right now, in the poll. And so that's a good point to say, pause, right? Rather than continue on and collect another 300 interviews, knowing we've got a tax rate range that's maybe beyond what this community is interested in supporting at the moment, let's stop, make some adjustments, and then move on from here. That's one example of how, of how we might do that. We have had other cases just in the last 6 months here where it is interesting because with COVID and the pandemic and protests and other things, there's a lot of big events that happen. And sometimes you can be in the middle of the field and all of a sudden something happens, right? And you think that could be, materially related to how a voter might, look at this measure. And so we will take that moment to pause, maybe insert a few information items or arguments in a poll to capture that moment and then continue on with the research.
And your methods have changed over time. I think when you started this,
Yes.
you called them, they picked up probably on a rotary phone and were pretty eager to talk. I think for a while they weren't so eager. How is it now?
So, yeah, having been in the business now for 20 years, a lot has changed in that respect. I mean, for probably the first 10 years I was in the business, it was what I would refer to as the golden age of the telephone interview, right? And that was a situation. Reason why it was the golden age is because everybody had a landline, right? Every household had a landline. Phones used to be stuck to the wall, and nobody had caller ID, right? And so when the phone rang, you had to actually go over, pick it up, and answer to figure out who's on the other end. And when you did that, we had a good chance of completing an interview with you, right? Well, as people started moving over to cell phones and migrating away, landlines have become fewer and far between, right? And it isn't that we don't still call cell phones, we do. And in fact, probably 2/3 at least of the interviews we do by telephone these days are on cell phones. The challenge with cell phones is that it is trained people that you don't just pick up and say hello, right? You look down at that number to see, is this a number I want to pick up or not? And there's a certain percentage of people out there who, if they don't recognize the number, they will not pick up the phone, right? And from a inferential statistics perspective, that's a problem because this is somebody who's been randomly sampled. And if using just telephone, they refuse to answer the phone, their probability really of being selected isn't some number, it's 0, right? You call them all day long, they're not going to actually be part of your study. And so recognizing that, we had started exploring different methodologies for how you go about doing these types of studies. And over time, what we've evolved to is what's called mixed methodology, where we're still using telephone, right? And we still do recruit that way and recruit for landlines as well as cell phones. But we're also now using other recruiting methods like email, as well as mailed invitations at times, and allowing people to participate online at a password protected website. And what you find now is, we did a lot of testing around that to make sure it worked. We knew it worked in certain types of situations. We were concerned about how it might bias results in others. And so we did a lot of testing to figure out exactly what sort of bias this might introduce. And ultimately became pretty comfortable with the idea that the mixed method is ultimately a better methodology, particularly for school bond measures than phone. But we wanted to make sure we were solid on that before we just migrated over.
Yeah, I remember that. And I was impressed by your approach there, where I think the scenario that I'm talking about, you did a standard phone sample. And then what you did was you did your the internet or whatever that approach is to get to the mixed methodology. But you didn't rely on the internet information until you could test it against the phone conversation to see if it's significantly the same.
Yeah, that was actually for Irvine,
USC,
for their bond, right? We did that split on them to sort of really test this rigorously side by side. And they were so close to each other. They were only 2% different, which is well within the margin of error of a normal poll. That we dug in to look at who we're actually able to complete interviews with, and ultimately what their responses were, and it just was it worked really well when you layer them together that way.
So Tim, the stuff we do, I am fascinated with, love it. Can't wait to get your top lines when you give me a sneak peek every now and then, or most of the time, I should say. But what I would say is I think the audience might find some of the other things you do maybe a little more interesting than bond measures. Is there any projects now that are really standing out to you as particularly interesting?
Oh, in terms of my research?
Yes.
The one that we're doing, in fact, we're just wrapping up now, is very different than your typical bond measure study. We're actually doing a survey looking at the travel patterns and travel characteristics of people who come into the United States, in particular San Diego County, through the San Isidro, Otay Mesa, and Tecate ports of entry. And the study is actually designed to help transportation modelers in San Diego County understand how the traffic flows coming in from Mexico impact the transportation system so they can plan accordingly. And the only way they can do that, when they look at sort of within San Diego County, they can do a household survey of San Diego County residents and get that information from them in terms of how they travel and where they go. But to be able to understand how the flows up from Mexico are impacting the day-to-day transportation, they hired us to do a study, and we literally just completed close to 8,000 interviews and travel diaries with individuals who were coming up from Mexico into San Diego County for day trips typically, or oftentimes a couple longer trips. But you can imagine in today's day environment, right, with the way the border has been politicized and other things, that's a pretty challenging job to pull off. And happy to say that we're nearing the end of it.
Yeah, well, I could just imagine you with your clipboard and your pencil out there saying, "Excuse me, would you mind sharing with me what you plan on doing in the United States today?"
Yeah, well, my Spanish is no bueno.
Okay.
We do have others who are much more able to speak fluently in Spanish. And yes, so we had a data collection crew down in Mexico on one side where the recruiting was happening, and then we also had a retrieval team on the U.S. side. So it's quite an effort, and I think we were in the field for close to 3 months.
Well, I think in our business, we used to have closing dinners, and that was when after a bond deal, you'd come together and go to a nice restaurant and have a closing dinner. We don't do them anymore, but I think this deal warrants a closing dinner.
Yeah, as soon as the pandemic lifts, we literally had that on the table to do, and then of course the pandemic hit. So as soon as that one's done, we will definitely be rounding people up around the table.
What do you find 2020 was like? I think we all understand that March had a lower success rate than we've seen previously, and less elections on in November of 20. Do you have any takeaways for the audience on kind of what 2020 means going forward?
Well, I think going up to 2020, right, that what we experienced to that point was what I would call far more stable electoral environments, right? That leading up to 2020, you could do a poll 10 months advance, oftentimes, of election day, find out that the community feels positively, let's say, in supportive of this particular measure, and kind of, count on the fact that barring some big event, right, barring some major macro level change, that poll was going to track reasonably well towards election day, which is why leading up to the March 2020 election, as you know, like we hadn't lost a measure on the ballot since I think 2015, right? We only had one then, and so we had this perfect track record heading into March of 2020, and because I think the election environment's much more stable. What happened for March of 2020 in particular was sort of a real exercise in what happens when you not only have macro level events intervening between polling and election day, but there's multiples of them and they're all negative, right? So a lot of districts that were polling, say in sort of summer of 2019, planning for say a March 2020 election, what happened after that were things like the impeachment of President Trump, right, which basically created a very hyper-partisan environment. Every day for 5 months straight, right, the impeachment was top news, and that tended to create a real partisan divide between Democrats and Republicans, and that had the effect of sort of pushing down support for some of these revenue measures among Republicans because they are eating a steady diet of toe the party line. That's happening, and so we saw that in some of the tracking polling that was happening leading up to March was a lot of Republicans were fading away, right? That you normally That's a more tax adverse electorate, but we tended to find is that, they'd often consider the merits of a local proposal, right? Even though, I may be a Republican, I may be a little more tax adverse. Nevertheless, I'm willing to sit down and consider the merits of a school bond measure in my community, for example. And we just found less of that in March than you would normally find. And then obviously heading right before the March election, about 2 weeks before, is when COVID hit. And, people got pretty panicked, right? I mean, both from their public health perspective. I mean, we're now in a worldwide pandemic and everyone was starting to fear that. And there was a lot of concern about what this was going to do to the economy. And we saw that happen about 2 weeks before the election. The stock market started its nosedive, ultimately went down 30 points, right? But by election day, I think it had gone down about 13 points. And, the stock market is really a reflection of people's expectations for the future, right? The expectations of where the economy is going. And so that gives you you look at the Dow drop, that gives you a really good idea of how much fear there was in the market out there. And what you tend to find is when, voters are really concerned about their financial futures, that tends not to be the environment when they're willing to vote yes on a tax measure, right? So when you add those things together, you had, a bit of a combination of negative events that sort of shaped what happened on election day. And you can see, interestingly enough, when you look at the statewide election, this is not something that happened in one school district or two school districts or a couple of different communities. It was statewide, right? That across the board, all types of measures, particularly school bonds, but across the state, all underperformed where we would expect them to be based on polling, say 10 months earlier before all these events occurred.
Interesting. It certainly was a bit of a shock for school districts, and then to have really a change in education program all in that same time frame from in-person to distance learning certainly has been a challenge for them.
Yeah, and it's such a weird, it's kind of a whiplash effect, because if you remember the November 2018 election, right, the prior major election that we had, that was a very positive election, right? That was an election where you had a number of measures probably be successful that wouldn't have succeeded in a normal turnout, but the turnout was so positive and a somewhat tax-friendly electoral profile that the success rate around the state was very high for measures. In fact, I think for city sales tax measures, which generally pass around 72%, the passage rate in that election was over 90%, right? So we went from what was a very positive election when it came to tax elections to, in March, because of the events I just talked about, a very disappointing election, historically low passage rates around the state. I think the passage rate was something like 37% when the average passage rate statewide for the 10 years prior was in the low 80s, right? So it was just a real anomaly of an election. And I think looking forward, I expect that, that things will continue to be a bit challenging, but I don't expect them to be challenging like the March scenario, right? And the other thing is we now are living that post-March environment, and the polling will reflect that, that scenario, whereas the polling done 10 months prior to March really didn't pick up a lot of those big events, the effects of those big events.
There's one probably last point for us to try to discuss on this, and that is the language associated with GEO-bond measures appears to be getting more confusing, harder to understand, kind of some ambiguity built into the language each cycle. And when you have an increase in turnout, that may have overridden and helped get these measures to pass. When you have a pandemic starting, the stock market crashing, a primary election versus a general election, your turnout might have dropped to a degree that some of those language things started to be more of a challenge. What do you think of that?
I think that's absolutely the case. In fact, when you go back to that November 2018 election, right, which was a very good election for tax measures in general, one of the interesting things was, as you know, prior to that election, AB 195 changed the way the 75-word ballot statement for a school bond must be read. And it introduced some items that we know from researching this, voters find confusing for the most part. And a confused voter tends to be default to a no position, right? They don't understand what you're asking them to vote on. Their default isn't a yes, it tends to be a no. Right. And so we knew that going into the election. But because of that, what we call the blue wave turnout that happened in November 2018, where you had a younger, more Democratic, more liberal electorate than what you would normally see for that election environment, that turnout really helped offset the effects of AB 195, and such that you found that it was a successful election. But if you look not just at bonds, but you sort of widen your gaze to look at the other types of tax measures that were on that ballot, what you can see is the effects of AB 195. The reason for that is school bonds pass at their historical average in November 2018. Every other type of tax measure passed well above their historical average, right? And so you could see it, if you knew what you were looking at, you could see it in that November 18 election. Fast forward to March 2020, you don't have the blue wave turnout, so that's gone. And then you also have those other factors I talked about in terms of the impeachment driving a wedge based on partisanship, the pandemic, the fear about where the economy was going, and now it's sort of laid raw the AB 190 effects on top of that. And that's why we went from 80-something% support or passage rates for bonds in November of 18 down to 37% in March, right? So I think moving forward, minus those macro level factors that really broadsided the March 2020 election, we're still going to have to contend with that ballot language for school bonds because it's there, right? There's been several attempts to change it just because it is confusing for voters, and those attempts have ultimately been unsuccessful. And so we need to sort of be factoring, and districts need to be factoring that in, that it's probably, it used to be the school bonds were the easy things to pass, right? At 55%, and you had language that wasn't confusing, they were among the easier types of measures to pass. Now you got to work harder, right? And you got to make your case more compelling. You got to make sure your measure is aligned with your voters' priorities, more so than maybe you did in the past.
Tim, thank you for sharing that and diving into some of those details with us. Tell us a bit about your family.
So I have, my immediate family is my wife Frontine, and my daughter Willow, and my son Gavin. Both Willow is a senior in high school and Gavin is a sophomore. Both fantastic kids. I will tell you, I'm a tough guy to please in a lot of ways, and my kids, I'm just proud to say, are amazing. And they don't give me any grief. They're great students. Beyond that, we have an extended family, as you know. We have about 10 Angora goats. So my wife is a fiber artist of sorts, and so we call it the hoof to hat operation, right? So she raises Angora goats and Pygora goats. She shears them, she processes the mohair and dyes it, spins it, and then knits it into all sorts of stuff, including beanies and hats. And so we have like 10 Angora goats, which is probably 5 more than I wish we had, but and then we have 3 dogs, 2 giant salcata tortoises, bunch of chickens. So we have like about 3.5 acre little homestead that keeps Frontine very busy, and it's great.
That sounds like a lot. And I have had a chance to meet your wife. She's a wonderful woman. At the time, I did not know to the extent that she's the hoof to hat. I didn't quite know that whole process.
We can set you up, Adam. We've got at least 5 goats I can bring on over tomorrow if you like. It's a nice learning experience.
I have not interviewed this person for Public Finance Conversation, but there's an attorney that we work with, and you've worked with this firm. But I was talking with her. Her husband was a winemaker, and they had to get goats to help clean up the fields for the wine. Anyway, the guy pulls up in a Taurus, and 2 goats hop out of the Taurus. So truck or anything. So I guess the goats travel pretty easily, huh?
So now there's a whole nuance that we could get into. There's a difference between what they call grazers and browsers, right? Grazers sounds like what he has. They'll eat anything. Our goats are what we call browsers, right? If you let them out, they don't go eat the weeds. They go eat your flowers, right? And they go around, they pick the tasty things, which tend to be the things you actually want to hold on to.
Oh, man.
So, unfortunately, we don't have that side benefit of goats where they can go eat weeds. Yeah.
Well, Tim, I want to thank you for doing this again. There's a few things I just want to say to you before we wrap up. One is, I've always appreciated how well prepared you are. It feels to me like you put a lot of work in on the front end, and so that by the time you get to where you need to deliver something, you have a package that you can rely on. There's layers to it, and we get a very good result. I think that's really worked well to have build confidence in me and also our clients. I
Thank
also
you.
find that you're very passionate about what you do. Is if you believe that this should be done a certain way, you're going to argue for it, and we don't see that with everyone. I really appreciate that you do that. I also really appreciate your sense of humor. I think I've been in some very stressful situations with you, and I walk away, I think, with tears in my eyes because I'm laughing so hard. And so really appreciate that. And then we hit on just briefly, but one of the things I think is also really great about you is you work hard and you play hard. And you take that play hard with your family and you get away and you do that. Some people aren't able to do that. I've always really valued that you do that. So once again, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I know that, I mean, obviously I would think that if you're going to follow a passion as we have here in the company, and we've chosen to keep it the way we have in part because we believe in the research, right? It's something I enjoy doing. And I think it's, as I believe in your field as well, it's really your professional responsibility to make sure you're being honest with your clients, right? You know, it's easy to tell somebody what they want to hear, right? I think it's your professional responsibility to tell them what they need to hear, right? So that at the end of the day, if the end goal is, hey, we want to make sure we have a measure that's successful, you know, sometimes that means being, you know, having some tough love conversations along the way to say, look, you know, I know you want to build this particular, you know, facility, but your voters aren't into it, right? And it's important that we, you know, consider the risks of putting that in your measure before you go do it, right? And you're right, it's easy to sometimes just say yes, 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 and go along. But at the end of the day, the end result isn't better for that, right? It's better if you can be honest with your clients and tell them what they need to hear and, you know, ultimately help them achieve their goals that way. So, and then on the play hard, work hard thing, you know, life's short, right? I mean, it's important to do this, but it's also really important from my perspective to have a life outside the office. And you're right, I do my best to make the most of the hours.
Great. So thank you again. I really appreciate the time you've taken with us.
Great, thank you, Adam. Take care.